My name is Martin Hall. I've been in charge of the Bycatch programs at the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission for about 30 years now, and we've been dealing with bycatches of different types, dolphins, sea turtles, and other species in different fisheries. So we are dedicated to this issue, and we have developed a relatively long experience, and we have learned quite a few lessons, which is what we want to share with you. And one of those lessons is, which is at the core of these workshops, is the fact that we have a lot to learn from a fishing community that is committed to help us solve the problems, and we go to them in a very direct way. And we have developed through the years a system based on the acquisition of data through observer programs, a scientific analysis of those data to identify the problems, and then a continuous interaction with the fishermen to find the solutions to those problems. And that's the process that we have used with dolphins, with sea turtles, and with all the other species. And this is a process that we utilize as a normal way to develop a strategy to address a problem. Fishing, like all other human productive activities, has impacts on the ecosystem because of the harvest and because of other species which are affected by fishing practices. The objective of a modern approach to fisheries is sustainable fisheries where the impacts on the ecosystem are minimized. One of those impacts is the one called bycatch, and I can describe the concept based on this slide that you're observing now. Imagine that everything that is retained in the net is called captures, a name that we invent to describe the whole physical content of a per seine. Of that fraction, there are some animals that we can release alive and we expect to survive. We call that the release. An example would be dolphins in the tuna fishery, where we had a major success in reducing the bycatch by 99% while maintaining a fishery which is highly productive. So that portion goes back to the ecosystem unharmed. Another portion is retained by the boat because it has economic value. We call that the catch. And it is an economic term. It's just defined by the economics of the situation and includes all the species that the fishermen retain and utilize. The third concept, which is bycatch, is what is discarded dead. Basically, what is discarded dead is something that is no gain for the fishers and no gain for the ecosystem. It's in a way, in other words, the waste of the fishery. So the objective of a fishery is a sustainable catch where all the species are well managed, and then a minimum bycatch where the impact on the ecosystem is the minimum to produce the catches. And these are the basic concepts. So the idea of this program is to produce sustainable tuna fisheries in the per seine gear that we are working on, and at the same time minimize the bycatches, the discarded dead of other species. And of those bycatches, some of them are species of conservation significance because they are long-lived individuals with a small number of offspring and long reproductive cycles and so on. So those are special problems from the point of view of conservation. Others are species which are highly productive and perhaps don't have problems of that sort. So we deal with these different issues in different ways. So conservation issues require that we release those individuals as much as we can, whereas some of the others can be utilized. We're going to show you a couple of examples of the different practices.
There's also a certain group of characteristic species that appear when we talk about bycatch in tuna fisheries, in per seine fisheries, and these comprise turtles, bony fish, whale sharks, manta rays, small tuna, and sharks. Perhaps the most important at the moment, the one we're focusing most on, is sharks, because their populations are declining and these species are in danger in some areas, and we want to try to maximize the survival of these sharks.
what we want to do is to develop what I call an engineering approach. Simply decompose the problem into stages and see how can we deal with it. And in this case, is a series of stages, a sequential approach. So if we want to avoid incidental mortality of something that we don't want to kill, first of all, can I avoid capturing that individual? So if I don't encircle the individual, there is no danger of killing it. So first thing is avoid capturing it. If I fail to do that, the individual is in the net. Can I release it from the net now? In the case of the dolphins in the tuna fishery, there is a maneuver invented by the fishermen that allows the dolphins to be flushed out of the net while retaining the tuna. So that happens, and it's a solution to the problem. If you fail to release them that way, you bring them to the deck of the boat, and then you have to develop techniques to release the animals, which are based in science, to try to maximize the survival. And then if you fail and the individuals are dead on the deck, there are some species that you cannot retain because of legal issues or regulations, but there are other species that you can retain, and in the past, some of them have not been retained. So the last issue is utilization. If something is dead on the deck and you utilize it, you turn a bycatch into a catch. So how can we do with these species? Well, many of them had no markets. In some cases, the storage in the SEINERS, which is a brine solution used for tuna, was not adequate to storing these other species. But there were some species which are very valued by the public, such as mahi-mahi, wahus, and other species. And what happened in recent years was a development of techniques of capturing these individuals of high value from the net, developments on the boats utilizing wells for these other species without the brine solution, and then the development of a secondary industry, which is, for instance, doing very well in Ecuador, where there are plants which are now receiving all these species that were discarded before, utilizing them into products. And in this slide, it shows a variety of the products that are being used. They are produced, they are packaged, and they are sold, and they are exported. So there's a big source of funds for a country. They're a source of exports. And it was a product that was dead and discarded before. So it went from no value to being a significant export product for a country. So these animals can be utilized because they are very highly productive. And only a few species fall in this category, and they have a very good market. So mahi-mahis and wahus are good examples of this. We do not utilize the shark species, which are the ones which are problematic, or species which are conservation issues. We are not proposing that, but there are many that can be utilized. So some of these species used to be discarded in an 80% or more. Now the discards are of the order of 10 or 15%. So this has been turning waste into a product, and at the same time filling the boats with something that helps reduce excess capacity in the fleets. The research that is necessary for some of these release techniques is very important, and it's something that we have made very, very strong progress in recent years. And you have individuals of different species that arrive at the deck. And the question is, you want to put them back in the water in a way that you maximize the chances of survival of these individuals. So the crews have developed their own techniques, but those techniques were based on practical considerations and not necessarily knowledge about the individual. In some cases, they were also unsafe for the crews develop and utilizing these techniques. We need to develop methods which are based on the best veterinary science and biology, which are good to maximize the survival of the individual release, at the same time being very careful that the safety of the crews is not put in danger in any moment. So that's one of the issues, to do successful release from the deck, which is one of the maneuvers that we need to do. So for instance, for sharks, you can see some examples here which are not exactly healthy for the crew doing that type of movement. Another example which is fairly common is the trying to lift a large shark using some of the winches in the boat from the tail. And a heavy animal lifted by the tail has an anatomy that is not prepared for that type of pressure. You can imagine that a shark is never hanging from its tail in a normal situation in the ocean. So a movement like that, even though it's trying to release the shark alive, it may cause exactly what they didn't mean to cause, and just kill the animal in the process of trying to release it. So we need to develop better techniques to do that. So one of the issues is to improve the practices used to release animals from the deck and to disseminate that information to maximize survival. So sharks which are small can be safely handled utilizing 2 points, just putting one hand in the tail and one in one of the lateral fins, or there are other techniques which have been developed by the crews, and in general it's not a huge challenge. The larger animals are more of a problem. But the techniques have to be safe for the crews so that the animals cannot turn around and bite the person releasing them. The other sharks they need to be released from the deck. And in recent years, there have been experiments, many of them funded by ISSF, where they have tested different alternatives. And for instance, a small device used to carry very safely, and for the crew and for the shark, a relatively large shark out of the deck. It's a very simple system. And in other cases, they have to adapt the release method to the vessel type and to the machinery and equipment on the deck. But ideas like this are being tested now for sharks, manta rays, and other species, and I'll show you some other examples. So the turtle releases are another issue of significance. The number of turtles caught in the Seine fishery is extremely low, and we're very fortunate with that. There are a few which are entangled in the net, and a few which are caught inside they're entangled or caught inside the Seine. Most of those, practically all of them, are alive when they are encountered. So good release techniques result in survival. And at the present time, the mortality of sea turtles in the whole Eastern Pacific region, for instance, is about less than a couple of dozen. And of the turtle, which is the most numerous, most abundant, and it's a turtle that is increasing in numbers. So we're extremely lucky that the turtles, which are 2 or 3 species, are deeply endangered. Those are not attracted to fats in general, so they are not caught by the SEINERS. But they do have problems from other fisheries and from other factors. So the turtles must be handled by 2 positions, and it's illustrated in the left side of this slide. And what should be avoided is turning the animals upside down and leaving them on the deck, heat on them for a long time, or lifting them from the flippers, because these animals don't have the joints prepared to the type of stress that is caused by somebody lifting them that way. So they should be used with 2 hands, 2 points, make for a very good release, and they are luckily infrequent issues. So practically no problems from this fishery on the sea turtle, from the Seine fisheries, but the several species of sea turtles are deeply endangered because of impacts of different types. Another group of species of interest are the manta rays. The number of manta rays captured is not large, but it's very difficult to say what is large and small in the absence of total population data. We don't know what is the size of the populations of manta rays, but we do know that they're very vulnerable because of their life cycles, and I will say a few things about that in a minute. Manta rays are very large, and the efforts to release them are complex and risky for the crews and for the animals. So we suggest a couple of things, and at least we have identified practices that need to be eliminated. So the traditional method of release are these two illustrated here. And they are practical given the conditions of the boats, but we believe that both are extremely harmful, if not deadly, for the animals. So we are quite convinced that these two methods should be eliminated. So what we've done from here on is go to skippers and crews and say, if you want to release these individuals and you don't do it this way, which are the options that we have? And what is happening right now, which is one of the interesting things about this program, in different oceans, different people are testing different ways to release the manta rays alive. And so I will show you a few examples, but there are more things in development, and we receive ideas from fishing skippers, sometimes even from the sea, saying we are building this type of prototype to release the animals. One of the very rewarding things of this type of activity is that when you go to the fishing community and you bring a problem and you ask for the cooperation to find a solution, you really find the cooperation and you find the interest and the curiosity. They understand what the problems are, and then they become a force in finding a solution to the problem. So these are the methods that we believe should be eliminated, and then we show you a couple of reasons. First of all, the manta rays, like sharks and other species, are very vulnerable because of their life cycle. They have sexual maturity, which is 3 or 6 years. They have only one or a few offspring every 1 to 3 years, a very long gestation period. So even a mortality of a few thousand individuals may be significant. And in this case, we don't know how localized the populations of manta rays are. So to assess the impact of the mortality is very difficult. So instead of spending a lot of time trying to assess that impact, the objective is fishermen don't want to keep the manta rays. Then what we need to do is give them a good way to facilitate the release and measure the survival. In some cases, the tuna and the other components of the catch are dumped on the deck of the boat on some structures called hoppers. Those hoppers are very useful to separate bycatch or to identify where the problems are. And nets or other things can be put on top of those hoppers. There are ideas to put hoppers which are tilted so that some of the large animals can be moved aside. And one concept that is important is lifting animals like large sharks or manta rays is not a great idea for the survival of the animal. So we need to look for formulas where either they can be released without lifting or where the lifting is more benign than the current systems. So the diagram that you have now shows an example where one of those structures includes a tilted plane that facilitates the release of the sharks through an opening on the side of the boat. So we are asking the modification of the side of the boat to include an opening, some type of a door, sliding door, or some other type that makes it easy to slide an individual back into the water without lifting them over the side of the boat, which is a more practical way. So this case goes from the brailer into a plane and back into the water. So we have, since we started talking about this, some of the vessels have started developing different styles of these ramps doors. And we hope to have more improvement in this along this line. And it's something very important. It requires that they also consider the safety of the crew by putting openings, additional openings on the deck. But this is an area of lot of progress and promise. So to illustrate the magnitude of the problem, here is an image of one of the largest manta rays that has been observed. And this is, don't believe that this is the norm, the norm are probably under 2 meters in width. This is one of the giants that can be caught in a Seine. So these individuals present a major problem for the crews and for the animals, of course. And they are very valuable from the point of view of conservation because they are usually highly reproductive individuals and so on. And some of the rare species may be in this category. So this is a kind of challenge that is necessary. And we need techniques that work for individuals like this. And then a side door with sliding the individual laterally, which was the advice from an expert on manta rays, could result in a safe release. And all these ideas should be accompanied by scientific experiment showing that after the release, there is survival. We don't want to put them in the water to feel good. We want to put them in the water to ensure their survival. So the idea is make sure that what we're doing is effective for the animals. So here you have a couple of examples of ideas. And they are smaller sizes than what we'd like to see, but they are the beginnings of this process of adding ramps and openings on the side of the boat to facilitate the release of large individuals. You have an example with this video of the difficulties that are presented when the attempt to release an individual are done manually and without a really strategy for release. So in this case, you have 5 individuals trying to move a manta ray out over the side of the boat, and it is a relatively clumsy maneuver. It takes a lot of time. It's not. It doesn't look like something fluid that you want to imitate. So this is an example of the degree of difficulty of the release and the fact that we need more effective ways to do this. Okay, in the video that you are seeing now, you can see an animal which is brought by a brailer to the deck of the boat, and you see the crew approaching the animals. In many cases, these species are in the upper part of what is put on the deck, and then the crew uses, in this case, type of netting to capture the animal and to release it over the side. They are testing different types of netting, and they are more effective in moving the animals from the point of view of survival. This is a lot less harmful than the previous technique, and the question is how effective, how practical, how quick is the maneuver for the fishermen compared to alternatives. So here you have it, and there it goes. And this maneuver is a lot more desirable from the point of view of the individuals than the traditional ones. For manta rays and large sharks, probably one of the most interesting concepts in view of many of the skippers is the use of what is called cargo nets. They are very large mesh nets, and the idea is that the catch is dumped on top of this large mesh net, the tuna go through the meshes, and the large individuals kept retained there, and they can be released using these nets. So this is an example of how the cargo net could work for the release of a manta ray, and these are some of the techniques that are being explored. This is something that many of the fishermen find very effective, and it's simple, it's very low cost, and relatively quick. So it's very desirable from the point of view of survival of manta rays, safety of the crew, etc.
Hello, I'm David E. Tano. I'm a tuna researcher. Been working with tuna research and research for applied management since the 80s. ISSF has been working with different organizations to try and develop best practices for the release of whale sharks. And in this regard, the skippers' workshops have been extremely important because it's the experience of the captains on the boat who have to deal with these significant issue, and quickly and efficiently, as much as possible. And it's their experience that we rely on in many cases. This diagram on the left shows one method of releasing a whale shark, which is called rolling the shark out of the net. This is a fairly passive way to pass a rope or a cable beneath the net and the animal attached to the cork line. And as it's pulled, it will submerge the cork line, and then through tightening and slacking of various parts of the net, roll it out. Now, this can be greatly assisted by, in the bottom left of the screen that you see, these are purpose-built weights connected by a heavy line or chain that can be lowered onto the cork line to help to sink the corks below the head of the animal. We know from talking to fishermen, it depends on various aspects of the conditions of the encirclement, and that would depend on the size of the animal, whether it's oriented to the bow or the stern, how much catch is in the net, and also the environmental conditions. On the right side, we have some warnings to not do. Obviously, it's not good to try and lift the animal by the tail or lift the animal out of the water at all. And we discourage connecting to the tail and towing the animals sideways. So these best practices are still in development with industry and working on these issues to minimize impacts to whale sharks.
Okay, this slide is showing that when we have FADs, it doesn't matter how much tuna is under the FAD, the amount of bycatch is always going to be more or less the same. So if we have a FAD with 300 tons of tuna or a FAD that has 10 tons of tuna, the amount of bycatch associated, bycatch species associated with that FAD are going to be very similar. And in this next slide, what we can see is a study that was conducted in the different oceans of the world, and it compared the sets that were done where 10 tons of tuna or less were caught, and the sets that had more than 10 tons of tuna. And what we can see in these examples, for example, if I point at the Western and Central Pacific Ocean, we can see that 27% of all the sets resulted in less than 10 tons of tuna. So 1/3 or 1/4 rather of the sets produce 1/4 of the bycatch. We were saying that all FADs have more or less the same bycatch species amount. When we look at the amount of tuna that is provided at the end of the year, only 3% of the total catch of tuna came from those 27% sets. So what this study showed is that those small sets produce a very small amount of tuna caught at the end of the year, but result in a larger amount of bycatch. So it would be advisable to avoid those small sets and target larger sets because they're more profitable for the fishermen. In this next set, we move on to the issue of FAD entanglement. And this slide shows research that was done in the Indian Ocean by fisheries scientists. And what these scientists did is they went and dived. They sent divers in the water next to the FADs, and they checked how many sharks were entangled in those FADs, if any. And they found that in 1/3 of the FADs, there was one shark entangled. And also, what they did is they put tags on live sharks, and in the graphic in the center of the screen, it shows that those sharks would move naturally for several days, 0 to 20 days there, and after a certain amount of time, they wouldn't move anymore, and after a couple of days, the tag would sink to the bottom of the sea. And we think that what was happening there is that the sharks were moving freely around the FAD. One day they become entangled, and they get stuck there. They die. Some other fish around might eat or nibble on them, and the tag falls down to the bottom of the sea.